Lawyers of Reddit, what was the best gotcha moment you ever experienced? Lady got into a minor fender bender with a truck in a casino parking lot. She backed out of a spot into him. My guy said she parked and went inside the casino for a few hours. At her deposition, she testified that she was so hurt she went right home and to a hospital. I asked if she was a frequent visitor of casino and if she had a rewards card. She was happy to tell me she did and she had gold status and showed me the card. I subpoenaed her rewards card's records and it showed she was playing slots for hours after the accident. My client's house burned down from an explosion in the fuel oil tank used to heat the house. It was clearly the oil maintenance company's fault, but his homeowner's insurance, from a very reputable company, still refused to pay out, citing a ridiculous technicality in his policy. Essentially, the policy covered damage caused by the oil heater, but they claimed that it was the storage tank that exploded and wasn't part of what was covered. So they deny his claim, which was about 1.2 million, and then I get involved. During a deposition with the claims adjuster, I ask how she came to the conclusion that the storage tank was not a part, or at least connected to, the heater. She states that she relied on her expert witness who was an engineer. Little did she know I had already checked this person's background. He had zero engineering experience or education. As most of you might know, you don't get attorney's fees in most cases. However, when an insurance company denies your claim in bad faith, now you do. Her little admission cost the company about $500k in fees, on top of the original claim for $1.2 million. And this is why so many people try to screw insurance companies. Because they are right there, trying to screw you too. Plaintiff had an x-ray of an allegedly broken arm. It seemed off to me and the dates didn't make sense. I was in-house at an academic medical center. I looked at the case more closely and discovered the plaintiff was a x-ray tech at another hospital. After that, it was all over. I was trying to get a restraining order for a woman and DV court from her son's father. We are presenting testimony and she details a story where he grabbed her arm and slammed it on the tub, breaking her wrist. On cross, I asked the accused if he ever broke my client's wrist on purpose. His response: freak, yeah, I did. She was 9 months pregnant, about to smoke crack and wouldn't stop. I tried to grab her arm to get the pipe and protect my unborn son. Frick me. She left that detail out in her conversations with me. You are bad guy, but this does not mean you are bad guy. I had a former client file for bankruptcy and in connection with that case brought an action against his landlord for violating the automatic stay. In order to prove damages, he wanted to show he paid my firm for legal fees in connection with the landlord's pursuit of rent and violation of the stay. So this former client's bankruptcy lawyer serves me a subpoena to show up at the bankruptcy hearing. He didn't ask me any questions prior but just gave me the gist of what the objective was. That is, verify with the court the time I spent and the cost to his client. The bankruptcy attorney called his client, my former client, to the stand first. He asked him questions related to his hiring my firm to do this and that as it related to his landlord. Apparently that's not enough. The bankruptcy attorney wants me to verify these facts as well. I get put on the stand and I'm asked to verify the invoice. I first object to the question as a precaution since it may be a violation of attorney-client privilege to answer the question and to cover me for any claim by the bar or my former client. As predicted, the judge overrules and orders me to answer. I review the invoice, answer: no, this is not my invoice. His attorney: I don't understand. This is your firm's logo and information, right? Me: yes. His attorney: and you provided these legal services, right? Me: number. A very confused attorney slowly started to put together, after a couple more follow-up questions, that this idiot client of ours had manufactured my invoice to prove his damages. Needless to say that I could have given his new attorney the heads up, but I wasn't going to help someone who had committed perjury to the court using my name. I had represented him in a completely different matter and this guy was trying to make some extra cash through this bankruptcy hearing. 2 lessons. Tell your attorney everything, and as an attorney, make sure your client feels comfortable to tell you everything. Cross-examining a custom home builder who had a lump sum contract, set price as opposed to cost plus, which means cost of the materials plus X% as builder fee, with the homeowner, who claimed he put 20% more labor, materials and building the home than the contracted provided for and he was suing for these excess costs. was asking him about an email with my client negotiating the price of the construction, and he volunteers that he knew he couldn't build it for that price. My head snaps up, supervising partner's head snaps up, and opposing counsel goes pale. Dialogue was something like, me, you quoted X price? Builder, yes. Me, you knew you couldn't build it for that price? Builder, yes. Me, you knew the homeowner was relying on that quote? Builder, yes. Me, you knew homeowner wouldn't have signed contract without that representation? Builder, yes. Me, and you told homeowner's lender you could do it for X? Builder, yes. Me, and bank relied on that price and wouldn't have given loan if knew it was wrong? Builder, yes. This is textbook fraudulent inducement and he had no idea. Builder got poured out in the arbitration award and slapped builder with sizable punitive damages on top of it. 5 minutes of testimony sunk his case because he volunteered information without being prompted. Plaintiff alleged he was so injured in an auto accident that he couldn't work, do any regular activities, or pick up his young kids. He then posted on his public FB profile him doing the ice bucket challenge. If you're not familiar, he basically lifted a huge cooler filled with ice water over his head. His attorney had no idea he had posted it. Once heard about a man who got a doctor to do him a report for his compo claim. Can't bend, can't lit, can't run, etc. Problem was, he had a paternity suit ongoing at the same time. Got the same doctor to write a report for that case, no restrictions on mobility, can pick up the kid, play with him, etc. As you can guess, he and the doctor got caught. Perhaps not my best, but it was recent and pretty good. I represented a guy whose car died in the middle of the freeway at 4 AM. He put his hazard lights and called 911 for help. At the same time, an LAPD cop, heading to work around the same time in a police unmarked car, was driving around 87-92 miles per hour. Deconstructionist. He doesn't see our guy, strikes him and causes a major 6-car collision, including overturning an 18-wheeler truck. Police arrive and take photos. LAPD officer claimed our guy did not have his hazard lights on and he was only driving 60 miles per hour. He was trying to put some of the fault on our guy. At the deposition of the investigating officer, she doesn't remember if our guy's hazard lights were on or not. Attorney bring photos from the scene. One of the photos showed my guy's hazard lights on. We were dismissed shortly thereafter. Not so much a gotcha as it is a defendant giving themselves up. When I worked for insurance defense, I handled a fraud case where a man reported his Rolex as being stolen. He was adamant that he was at a hotel and it was stolen. He has shown no proof of being in a hotel, so it's flagged. We go through the whole process and finally reached depositions. He gets sworn in and eventually let out that he wasn't at a hotel but rather with his mistress and he had left it at her house. His wife noticed he didn't have it on, so he immediately claims it must have been stolen, etc, etc. This man decided to hire an attorney and go through this whole circus just so his wife wouldn't find out about his affair. Needless to say, the claim was denied. Not a lawyer, but when I was in the military I was accused of something I didn't do, and I had to go to court over it. And during court the prosecutor started to detail this investigation and how they had staked my apartment out for months. They entered into evidence a picture of my apartment, and when they put it up I looked shocked at my lawyer. BC, it wasn't a picture of my place. It was my ex-wife's apartment, a place I had never lived, never even spent a single night there. I lived in a house, she lived in an apartment, and when my lawyer was asked if she objected to the picture being entered into evidence, she replied, I don't mind them entering it into evidence as long as they change the listing of it. And when one of the members of the panel, no judge, 3-member board, asked what was wrong with the listing, she looked at him and said that's not his apartment. On top of this, the witness they used against me described going to my house on the night in question and she named the subdivision where she had visited me, except that wasn't where I lived either, also wasn't where the picture they had was either. The case was dismissed and I was told they requested the witness to return to answer questions about perjury. Ianal. I lived with a guy when we were in our early 20s. He worked for one of those crappy furniture rental places where people without money get furniture. Much of his job was repossessing furniture, and in his spare time he was a skateboarder. He severely hurt his back on the job and they were contesting paying his bills and settling. At one of his mediation dates they revealed they had hired a private investigator to follow him. They showed him pictures of himself at a skate park skating when he was supposed to be home recovering. They asked him to verify it was him. He said no. These diffusers had somehow missed that he had a twin brother that also skated. They eventually settled for what I thought was a very low $70K. He had back pain for years that caused him to gain weight and suffer. In his 30s he finally had back surgery and he regretted not doing it 10 years earlier. He said it completely alleviated the pain. Had a client accused of leading the cops on a high-speed chase. The cop on the stand estimated he was going 90 miles per hour, but never actually clocked him. Then the cop identified where the chase started with me, and where it ended. It lasted about 2 miles. Then we went through his log of when it started and when it ended. About 3.5 minutes. Once you walk through the math on that, the average speed of this chase was 35 miles per hour. Client got acquitted really quickly after that. The first case I ever did, opposing counsel misplaced the copy of my client's driver's license. Rather than admitting his mistake and asking me to resend it, he filed a motion to compel, claiming we never sent it. Well, I was able to provide proof that we'd sent it to him like 8 months ago, so the judge was rather displeased with his antics. Represented a DUI client who swore up and down to me he hadn't been drinking or doing any drugs. Newbie officer who had his field training officer with him in the car. Rookie pulls client over for a tag violation. Walks back to the car with body camera still on. Training officer says get him out for a DUI and the rookie says but he's not intoxicated, to which the reply was do it anyway. Body cam clicks off. Turns on 7 minutes later and they're doing field sobriety exercises on my client. Client sat in custody for 3 weeks until I finally got the tape from the prosecutor and presented it to the judge. The oh crap looks from the prosecutor and FTO when the judge saw the tape. I'll treasure that one. Judge wrote the police chief a letter saying the FTO was dead to him and he'd deny every search warrant he tried to bring thereafter for being a liar. Client is hopefully still on track with his civil attorney in a lawsuit. I love body cams so very much. I was suing a landlord who failed to make serious repairs in order to force the tenant out. The hard part is proving bad intent instead of mere idiocy, so you get higher damages. Code enforcement was involved, so I request those records. The landlord left a voicemail to the enforcement department saying to hold off on the fines. They will make the repairs as soon as the tenant is forced out. That was an easy case. My brother is an attorney. He had a case where the guy said he was permanently disabled from a work accident. At a deposition my brother overheard the guy talking about getting his house remodeled. He was already spending the money he thought he was getting. My brother drove by the house to see how much work was being done and saw the guy carrying bundles of roofing shingles up a ladder to the roof. This was before smartphones, so he drove to a Best Buy and bought a video camera. Went back and recorded the guy. He had copies made and sent to the other attorney. The guy dropped the suit and was back at work the following Monday. My brother's client didn't want to pay for the video camera. He saved them thousands of dollars. They eventually paid, but he still gets a little peeved when he talks about it. Not a lawyer but a legal videographer. This gentleman was claiming injuries, seeking damages against his employer after a fall at work. He claimed he couldn't raise his right arm above his shoulder because of the fall. First deposition comes along and I am hired by defendant's attorney to videotape deposition of the plaintiff. Anyone know the first thing a court reporter asks you to do in a deposition? Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. Plaintiff raises his right arm above his shoulder with ease and no sign of discomfort. Does not occur to him what he has just done. Both attorneys were looking down at their notes when this happened and neither of them caught it. The plaintiff himself didn't catch it. The court reporter looked at him and then looked at me and her eyes went wide with realization at what just happened. 4 hours of deposition proceed wherein the plaintiff is instructed, multiple times, to show his range of motion and proceeds to pretend like he can't raise his arm above shoulder level, which he did at the very beginning of his deposition. Deposition ends. Plaintiff's counsel leaves. I call defense. Hiring party. Counsel over and show him the first 2 minutes of tape. Counsel excitedly whispers to me, "Case closed. You just saved us tens of thousands of dollars." I got a $5,000 bonus and plaintiff's case was dismissed with prejudice. I had client whose 60k car was ruined by a shop that put in the wrong oil. We couldn't prove it at first. The engine blew up, oil leaked out and evidence was lost. I subpoenaed their bank records, figured out they bought their oil from Costco, called Costco and got their prices for the last 2 years. I then worked out the amounts they were spending, did some backhand math, and showed based on the values it was impossible they had ever bought the right oil. They settled in full immediately. You gotta admit, it is the most satisfying thing when the opposition caves in immediately when you prove what they are saying is impossible. Not as exciting in the moment as some other ones here, but we hired a private investigator to track our defendant in a fraud asset recovery case. A private investigator returned with a photograph of torn pieces of paper that clearly constituted a ripped up note, albeit in a foreign language. I happened to know said foreign language, so pieced it together and realized it was a letter written by the defendant raging at his accomplice for making highly specific mistakes that fricked him over in the context of our fraud asset recovery case. Obviously, we later had this verified and sworn to via affidavit by an official translator. It was unbelievable. The handwriting was a match. Plus, he'd also signed it, and the contents were so specific. Contained information about specific amounts going into specific trusts under specific names, that it was basically a smoking gun. We almost thought they'd planted it to throw us off, but the guy was just stupid and arrogant. Ran into a bit of a fight admissibility, but the letter ultimately helped us receive a significant settlement that made our clients extremely happy. This is so petty. I've had much bigger moments, but because of the character of the other side this will always be my favorite. Doing a boundary dispute, a squabble over what was essentially a few inches of land. OS was a lawyer, and an absoluter. He was acting for himself. The whole a lawyer who acts for himself as a fool for a client thing was bang on for him. But he was a deeply unpleasant guy, a bully who thought that he was the smartest guy in the room. Part of his case hinged on wheelie bins and how prior to the boundary having been moved there wasn't space to store a full-size bin beside the house. The fact you now could meant clearly the boundary must have moved. That was the extent of his evidence. It really was thin stuff. During the actual trial he pulled a fast one by suddenly producing an old aerial photo ostensibly to show the boundary at the front of the property had also moved. A fast one because you have to disclose stuff like that in advance. You can't just sit on something relevant and then suddenly whip it out at trial with a flourish. Whilst he was making his submissions that it should be admissible, I looked more closely at it. Away from the bit of the boundary he said it was relevant to and realized that it very clearly showed a wheelie bin in exactly the spot his case said there couldn't be one. Told the judge we were happy for the photo be admitted after all, got the other side to confirm the date it was taken, then pointed out he'd just completely fricked his case. That photo did him for nearly 50k in adverse costs. Couldn't happen to a more deserving chapter. Score 1 for wheelie bins. Lawyers, what's the most obscure law that you've actually used in a case? One I heard from a criminal defense attorney in law school. His client is driving down a country road at night without any lights on. A police officer is parked off the side of the road and, seeing the man drive by, pulls out behind him to follow him but also doesn't turn on their headlights. Eventually they pull the man over and find that he has a lot of C in the cab of his trunk. Charges are brought for possession with intent to distribute. They get to court, and the attorney cites the fact that, under the relevant state law, it is not legally required to have your headlights on at night unless there is another vehicle visible within 500 feet of your vehicle. Because the police officer was also driving without headlights, the man had no reason to see them, and therefore he was legally allowed to drive without his headlights on. Because of this, there was no reason to have pulled the man over. Thus, the discovery of the C was fruit of the poisonous tree. That is, any evidence that is discovered improperly must also be excluded. Case dismissed. I hope that guy paid his attorney well because that attorney just got that dude out of some serious prison time. A law professor of mine was representing someone who owned a goose and was being sued by a neighbor because the deed said no geese. When the deed was written the singular and plural weren't interchangeable. Professor said deed only said no multiple geese and one goose was okay. Judge agreed. Judge was tired of hearing about a goose. Work for a debt collection law firm and we also do some subrogation work. State of Michigan has a law on the books from back in the day whereby cattle are exempt from liability in automobile accidents. Case involved an accident due to the cattle going across the road pretty suddenly and there was a car on cattle collision. Guess who got blindsided in court by this law from the 1800s? My maritime law professor was a glorious butthole and I'll never forget this story he told. For this, you need to know that below the mean high tide line on a beach is public access. My professor, in his younger days, had just finished the bar exam. He went to the beach. The beach was super overcrowded. Just a short walk down the shoreline was a private beach club. This beach and beach club were right near my college, so I've been there and seen both. The beach at the private beach club was wide open and much less crowded, so he walked down the shoreline and parked his chair somewhere below the mean high tide line. A few people from the beach club tried to get him to leave since he wasn't a member, but because he was in the public access section of the beach, legally they couldn't do anything. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, 1984, permits the police to take a sample of semen from a suspect in custody. I had to give advice to a public entity about the US flag code. An employee had raised a grievance that the way the flag was hung in a particular room violated the code. Technically, the employee was right. The question was what kind of remedy was enforceable under the flag code for a violation. The answer, none. Petty, upset employee got no satisfaction. I haven't used it yet, but the other day while researching a related issue I stumbled across a 100-year-old case that said summons served on Sundays were null ab initio. Hasn't been overruled, although it's probably dead letter. If I ever have to dispute a summons that was served on a Sunday I might pull it out and see how it goes. When I worked at the Court of Appeals I had a case about ferries and half of the relevant law was from 1830s to 1940s. Real weird. A client of mine was writing a scathing review of the Australian court system which he intended to publish in a book. When advising him regarding defamation etc., I ended up dredging up an old Australian law of scandalizing the courts whereby a person commits an offence if they incite disenchantment or distrust to the extent that it undermines public confidence in the judicial system. I cited a 1500s case from the UK on gravarobbing that stated that property can never be ownerless in a dispute over the ownership of a pile of dirt. I also cited a 1700s case on interpreting the rule against perpetuities. As a lawyer, I just had war flashbacks when I read rule against perpetuities. I don't know if this would be interesting to anyone else, but I drafted an MSJ last year where an insured inland marine trucking company had mistakenly delivered a filled cargo container back to port instead of the client, and it was shipped back to China where it was held by customs and the cargo was eventually destroyed. The insured's policy did not cover mishandling, misdelivery or misplaced cargo but provided coverage for all non-excluded losses. They tried to argue that, in misdelivering the cargo, they had lost it and, thus, it fell under the policy as a non-excluded loss. It only took them a week or so to locate the cargo on its way back to China, so it was never lost, but they still tried to claim that a loss in an insurance contract included anything lost. Dumb as crap argument, but the partner took out my entire section addressing the definition of loss, as in to lose, and loss in an insurance context, as in the monetary value of insured property, and we lost the MSJ. I'm, thankfully, no longer in commercial property insurance defense, but that one really annoyed me because it was such an obvious mischaracterization of the contractual language and such a stupid move by the partner. It's amazing how many eye rolls I get by lazy attorneys when they read my MSJs. Yes, I realize you think this is obvious, but if we take it out the argument is no longer foolproof. If you are entitled to a judgment as a matter of law, you shouldn't have any missing factual logic. We read a contracts case back in school that ultimately came down to the issue of whether a hot dog was a sandwich. There's a Supreme Court case about whether a tomato is a fruit or vegetable. I didn't, but worked in an insurance litigation firm where a guy used an 1800s maritime law to defend a case that occurred on a boat on Lake Michigan. He wanted to get it out of state court and into federal court where civil verdicts usually have less value in our area. That was neat. I routinely cite a 1921 case regarding a forged railroad ticket when I'm trying to argue the best evidence rule of an original that's later been marked up with pen or has some notes on it. The case says that if something is printed out containing all the elements of what it's trying to do, then any handwriting on it is evidence that it's been altered, and the alterations must be shown to be lawful by whomever seeks to enter the item into evidence. Very good to use to keep things out of evidence. Citation, please. Car sales tax case. Client has to post amount of disputed tax and then ask for the money back before getting an opportunity to sue to get money. There are also interest and penalties. If you do not send a letter asking for the state to not pursue, state can still go after client even though case is pending. On the letter to request the state not pursue, at the top must be written in red ink specific words, or the state can ignore the letter per the regulation. This case has been going on since 2006 and haven't been able to file a case yet in court. Also, state never actually has to respond to the request for refund. Obscure case, but frequently found in tax law to say the taxpayer is allowed to minimize tax liability. The Inland Revenue v. the Duke of Westminster, or commonly known as the Duke. Case is about whether the Duke is allowed to fire his gardener and give him an annual gift in exchange for his services. Nothing changed except now he can deduct tax on the amount. I used the statute of bastardy from Connecticut in a brief I wrote in law school. It was a criminal statute that provided the colonial US equivalent of child support. The legal definition of massage is so ridiculously overbroad in my state that it literally covers getting water pumped up your colon to clean out all the poop. We have a statute that prohibits certain kinds of car insurance from reimbursing providers for massage. I was dealing with this shady fly-by-night clinic that offered a bunch of bull services that didn't do anything. They were really just a massage parlor that pretended to do other crap to get around the billing issue. So I argued that everything they did was technically massage under the statute. Not a lawyer, but one time I had to sue a landlord who made up some pretend reasons to keep my security deposit. I spent a Saturday in the law library at the local university and found a law that would let me win my lawsuit and claim triple damages. The landlord read my lawsuit and offered to give me my deposit back plus $500. Sweet. Obligatory now. But I work at a lawyer's office in Germany. One of our lawyers managed to get our client off a speeding ticket by finding out whether or not you needed some sort of specific certificate to be allowed to operate the radar speeding gun. He found out there indeed was some obscure certification of many that is needed and is supposed to be renewed every 2 years or so. The officers who wrote the speeding ticket hadn't renewed theirs in a while. Apparently nobody did, though. Nobody even really knew about that specific certificate. He won the case. The judge agreed they shouldn't have been operating the radar gun without the certification, even though the dude really was speeding. Allegedly speeding. We will never know since the officer with the radar gun didn't have the proper certificate. He might have mishandled the radar gun or used it on another car. Typical mistakes for those who aren't certified. Where I went to school, the conservation law students had to do a paper on if hunting on horseback is considered hunting with the aid of a motor vehicle here in NY. The answer isn't what you think. I knew a guy who got a DUI on a horse in upstate. Not surprised at your answer. Canada has an apology act stating saying sorry does not show responsibility or take blame for the situation you may or may not be at fault in. The Apology Act wasn't passed until 2009. When I was taking driver's ed before this happened, they specifically taught us not to apologize after an accident because it could be deemed an admission of guilt. Asking a Canadian to not say sorry after a car accident, regardless of fault, is like asking a dog not to bark. It's just what they do. Not a lawyer but know of a weird law for hunting. You are not allowed to claim deer roadkill if you are not up to date on your child support payments. I had a competition with my brother, also a prosecutor who could cite international shoe first jurisdiction for minimal contacts and fair play. I won in a hearing over forcing an out-of-state adult book company to accept a subpoena. It's obscure case law, not a statute. A co-worker of mine used a court decision from the 1880s to successfully defend a document someone was trying to invalidate over an issue concerning a notary stamp. The stamp was clear enough to read, but had a slight smudge that the other side argued made it invalid. They were able to keep the document out in an administrative hearing, and won the case on that level based on that. We appealed it to district court. My co-worker found a case from the 1880s where the court described a notary stamp smudged in the same way and ruled it was valid. This was the only case she could find that addressed the issue. Based on that precedent, the district court overruled the administrative court and reversed its decision. Sir, I'm not here to have a philosophical debate about civil engineering. When the judge starts with the sass, you've already lost. I do remember hearing a story where this guy in Michigan was arrested for underage drinking, but was only a couple of months away from turning 21. He went to court and pulled out an abortion law for Michigan stating that life begins at conception. So when he asked the judge if this law was still valid, which it was, he then stated that since that was the case, he was technically over 21 years of age and legal to drink. The case was dismissed, and when the prosecutor made a stink about it, the guy said, "Hey, it's your rules." About 5 years ago, the managing partner of my Chicago firm made me write a motion for a writ of mandamus in a federal case we'd filed in California. The judge generously denied my motion without making me fly out to defend it in front of her. I am waiting for a chance to use my state's laws regarding Proud B. One statute requires B to be confined while proud for a certain period of time. Another statute provides that there is no liability for killing a Proud B that is not properly confined. Obviously, this refers to female dogs in heat, but the term proud is not defined anywhere in the state code as it relates to B. Now, but, in the 60s, my hippie brother was busted for a traffic infraction in Hingham, Massachusetts. While being patted down, he farted in the cop's face. He was charged with a colonial-era law, uttering in public, and fined. I miss him. I'm no lawyer, but there's a case that took place in the UK court. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC, v McVitie's. McVitie's make a biscuit called Jaffa Cakes and HMRC argues that they were a biscuit and subject to taxation. McVitie's argued that they were in fact a cake and cakes aren't subject to taxation. McVitie's made a bigger version of a Jaffa cake, cake size I guess, and argued that cakes go hard and biscuits go soft. The Jaffa cake went hard and McVitie's won the case. It's quite common that a jury will convict a guy but the conviction is overturned because the prosecution didn't present sufficient evidence of one of the elements of the offense. In an extremely rare version of this legal principle, my brother-in-law just had a case where the prosecution will forgot to present evidence proving the crime took place in the geographic jurisdiction, like county or state of the court. Jurisdiction must be proven like any other element of a crime. The closest they got in this case was someone's testimony that it happened at home. Conviction reversed. Defendant is free to go. When I was in college, a girl who worked at an expensive law firm told me this and I always wondered if it was true. She said that when Oklahoma passed a new drunk driving law that they specifically mentioned the breathalyzer machine that the cops had to use, and since it was a new one most places didn't have it. So if you got a DUI and they didn't use that machine or even owned old ones, you could get it dismissed by saying they weren't compliant with the law and used or could have used the old ones. She said they had gotten cases dismissed using that argument. Lawyers who read wills to families. What is the most interesting, bizarre, offensive, surprising thing you have had to read out loud? To my wife I'll leave her lover and the knowledge that I was never the fool she thought me. To my son I'll leave the pleasure of working for a living. For 25 years, he thought the pleasure was all mine. Best diss ever. Was in my wills and trusts book in law school as an example of people talking crap in their wills. You're supposed to discourage them as lawyers from doing so. A friend of mine was adopted at birth. When her mom died, the will gave half the estate to her 2 natural daughters. My friend got nothing. WTF. That was vindictive beyond belief. It's like saying, yeah, I raised you, but you were never truly my child. Best will story I personally know of. The father had a valuable antique grandfather clock. He also had 2 daughters. His solution: if I die on an even day, daughter A gets the clock. An odd day and daughter B gets it. The daughter who did not get the clock got an equivalent cash award based on the value of the clock. I know of the event because I had to service the clock several times over the years. We had the client itemize his rock collection in his will, including directions that certain rocks be deposited in certain rivers across Canada. My father-in-law was an accountant for some rather wealthy people. One of them was asking him to assist with writing up his will worth millions. The final addition he suggested was that if the children contested it, they get nothing. They contested it for years. It must be a bad feeling knowing you raised that sort of kids. I literally cannot imagine fighting with my sister over money. She has a hard time letting me pick up, like, every fourth restaurant check. We had a client who was a widowed farmer who owned several heavy equipment, Caterpillar trucks, etc. He had 2 sons who were already working with him at the farm and a daughter who was working in the city. He willed the heavy equipment to the daughter. When asked why, since these equipment were essential to the farm, he said that the farm was to go his kids equally, but his girl needed to know he always wanted her to join their venture and dispel her notions of alienation because she was a girl. Lawyer here. I once amended a will for a doctor in which he disinherited his son by removing everything he had intended to bequeath and replacing it with a manure spreader. I didn't ask any questions because changing a will is an easy thing to do. But one day, that doctor will die and his son will have essentially be told to eat crap. I was working as a legal secretary and had to leave someone's cats to various people. Fine. But I also had to leave money in the cat's name to various organizations. One of them was named Mr. Bobo. I enjoyed it thoroughly. My maternal grandpa was wealthy. He divorced my maternal grandma, remarried, and promptly dropped dead of a heart attack. He was only 48 and had no will, so everything went to his new wife, my mom's stepmother. She was actually really nice and was planning on making sure that everything was fair, till she died in a car accident 6 months later. She was a widow herself prior to marrying grandpa and had a now orphaned 15-year-old son from the previous marriage who got everything. My mom and her siblings had to go to the auction at their childhood home and buy back as much of their heirlooms and memories as they could afford, and, truthfully, stole some of what they couldn't. Tons. One client left a specific gift of $10,000 to one son, and left him out of the Pinstripes division of the residual estate, which was sizable at the time the will was drafted. This was intended as a serious disinheritance, which he apparently talked about all the time to make the disfavored son feel bad. However, by the time he died he had a serious reversal of fortune and his estate was about $10,000. So he effectively disinherited the good children and left the black sheep everything. The bad kid appeared very poor compared to the others, and the look of grateful surprise on the poor kid's face was almost as priceless as the shock on the others who thought they were getting rich. I heard this from another lawyer. Rich old lady leaves her entire sizable estate in a trust for the care and maintenance of her dog, as long as the dog shall live. On the dog's death, the trust paid out in full to the son. Apparently the son had Rover put down the day after the funeral and presented a demand to the trustee the very next day for the trust payout. She should have seen that one coming. I know. No lawyer here, but I had to share. A woman came in after her mother's funeral with some correspondence from the company I worked for, insurance. She was worried there was a bill she needed to pay and was coming to tell us her mom had died. She just looked so tired, and we got to talking while I looked up the policy to close it out. She shared that in the last few years her mom had slipped into dementia and she single-handedly took care of her. How she missed her but just was run ragged and she hadn't taken a vacation in forever. I realized what she had was not a health policy, it was a life insurance policy naming the daughter as the beneficiary for about $50,000. I told her and she just started crying. It made me cry and I got up and hugged her and sort of just held her while she cried. She pulled away and said, "I have no idea what she left that for. Everything's been paid for." I said, "This might be her telling you to go on that vacation and relax." It was so touching, and she had no idea that the policy existed. My estate planning professor told us about a guy who had 2 families, neither of which knew about the other until it was time to read the will. This wasn't like a love child mistress type scenario, both were nuclear multi-kid families. Both families showed up for what had to be one of the most awkward will reading in history. I don't really know how he pulled it off other than that he was away on business frequently. But here, have my mediocre will story anyway. My great grandmother left her daughter just $1 and not a single penny more, so help me God. This was before I was born. But my grandmother, not the daughter with the dollar, said that when they all read the will her sister had a full-blown temper tantrum and no one heard from her since. I guess she had it coming. In olden days, it used to be typical to bequeath $1 so that, if challenged, the judge saw that they were not forgotten and purposefully meant to not get more. If a close family member or loved one got nothing, they would often challenge they were forgotten. Might not be true in this case, but something I remember studying. In my trusts and estates class in law school, we read a case about a man who left everything to his wife, but only if she got his body stuffed and left it on the living room couch forever. Luckily for her, the court invalidated that part of the husband's will. Part of the reasoning was that it would make it impossible for her to remarry if she had her husband's creepy dead body glaring at anyone who came to see her. My grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran, suffered from PTSD. It got worse in his later years and he would often isolate himself from the rest of the family, often hiding out in his bedroom when visitors were over. My grandmother would often tell us stories about how he had inherited a significant amount of money from his father way back when. She said that in their younger years he often spent his inheritance on luxurious dates and trips. After returning from war, he spent the remaining money on a house in which he and my grandmother settled and raised their children. Fast forward to his death, just a couple months back, and we found out he had written a will. Even my grandmother didn't know about it. We all had assumed he wouldn't have much to leave since most of the money he had saved from his time in the military was going towards taking care of him as he was placed in a care facility as his PTSD worsened. His will told of a warehouse in Township, Michigan that held a large collection of vintage cars. He said that the warehouse was passed down from his father, and he had all the documents to prove that he was the owner of some type of warehouse. His will estimated that the cars be worth in excess of $2 million total. The money from his collection would be split between his 4 children. We had no idea this collection ever existed. My father and his 3 brothers had all grown up in Plano, Texas. None of us had ever been to Michigan before. Even our mother couldn't recall a time of our father ever having even gone to visit Michigan. After a long debate, my father and I, the only ones who could manage to find some time off from work, agreed to fly out to Michigan to see this collection firsthand. After a few $1,000s spent on plane tickets, hotels, we finally arrived at the warehouse my grandfather owned. It was a rundown warehouse, but it was tucked away within a compound of other warehouses that seemed to be otherwise well taken care of. Finally, code in hand, my father punched the numbers into the keypad and the giant door began to rise. What was inside was beyond words. There was absolutely nothing. Besides a few homeless people that managed to sneak in through a hole in the corrugated metal around back, there was no car collection. We were able to contact a few owners of the neighboring warehouses, and to their knowledge no one and nothing had ever been inside of those warehouses in the years they had been there. To this day we don't know what happened. We all just assume that the PTSD caused him to create some kind of fantasy in his mind. That maybe he purchased the warehouse believing it was a safe house for him if he ever needed to get out of Plano. My grandfather hated his neighbor. They lived next to each other for 20+ years. I remember well my grandfather raging at every opportunity about this guy. We never saw them speak to each other. In grandpa's will he left the guy $10K, a car and golf clubs. We were dumbstruck. Turns out they were good buddies from the army. When they coincidentally bought homes next to each other, they decided to play a long scam with both their families. They actually played golf together 2-3x per week and had a monthly poker game for years. To my daughter Anne, who created my beautiful granddaughter Jane, and her dear 4th husband John, who laid hands on my Jane, I leave $1, you money grubbing bastards. To Jane I'll leave all of my monetary assets, save $5,000 and my best gun, which I'll leave to my son Bill, on the condition that he beats John bloody during the time between my funeral and my burial. Jane, bail your uncle out of jail, please. Other than names, this is the exact wording of a great uncle's will. Part of it anyway. At age 9 Jean told her mother that John had molested her and her mother told her she deserved it for being a S. So great uncle took Jean in and raised her, and his 2 kids got exactly what it says. His son also got a truck and technically a house, although he only kept it until Jean was a legal adult and could afford the tax on it. Bill got full custody of Jane when his father died, and he put every penny of her money into a trust fund to mature when she was 25 because he felt like his sister would try to get the money. He was right. And in case anyone wondered, yes, Bill got his $5,000. He didn't get arrested though because John had a warrant on him, so they didn't dare call the cops. Bill did kindly inform the police of his whereabouts a few weeks later. That is beautiful. Something about revenge from beyond the grave, or at least on the way to it. Not a lawyer, but sort of a sad story. When my dad's mother died, Her will stipulated that everything was to be liquidated and the money distributed equally between her children and grandchildren. Fine, but literally everything had to be sold. There were family heirlooms, jewelry, things my grandfather, a carpenter, had made, so many sentimental family things that my father and his siblings badly wanted, but it all had to be sold. They all went to the auction to try to buy some of the more sentimental items but weren't always successful. It was heartbreaking and I'm not sure what made my grandmother think it would be a good idea. Nobody wanted the money. They wanted her wedding ring and the clocks my grandfather had made and all that. It was heartbreaking and I'm not sure what made my grandmother think it would be a good idea. Nobody wanted the money. They wanted her wedding ring and the clocks my grandfather had made and all that. Most likely she didn't want her family fighting over her belongings. I used to work for an accountant and we used to make wills as well. An old man probably around 70 left all his money to his mistress while his wife only got the goldfish. I had to tell him that if his wife contested it she would most definitely win. He said he didn't care. Not me but my friend's father's father died and he said when the guy reviewed the will with his lawyer and his sister, it said to give 100% of the assets to his sister. He said he had no idea why his father did that. He wasn't on bad terms or anything. It was shocking to him. The sister didn't share anything with him either, and they were on pretty good terms before that. When my great uncle died he left his beloved dog to his longtime girlfriend. All of his money went into a pet trust for said dog, which turned out to be quite a large sum of money. His 2 kids got nothing. As far as I know he didn't have a bad relationship with them or anything. He just thought the world of his little dog. One summer I worked as an administrative assistant to a lawyer who worked in wills and estates. Most of it was the usual petty arguing about percentages of money, but one couple was deeply concerned about which of their children would receive the urn with the ashes of the family's long deceased cat. Wouldn't want to play favorites. One of my college buddies' dad died from cancer in our second year. It wasn't a sudden death. He had been battling it for a couple years. When my friend came back to school, he casually mentioned that his dad left him and his sister $7 million each. Turns out, his dad had hit the lottery before my friend was born, invested, put all the money away to help pay for college, high school. His mom got a nice chunk of change also. He grew up thinking they were just ordinary middle class family. We had a glorious 3rd and 4th year of college, thanks to my loaded friend. Someone had left an entire golf course that he owned and managed in secret to his son. They were avid golfers, but always went to another course. I still don't know why someone would lie about owning a golf course. My will has something unusual. Story time. I sat my wife down to have the talk because I was getting ready to deploy to Iraq. This was during the incredible sectarian violence, and I wanted to make sure she knew everything to do in case I died. She's never serious, ever, but I wanted her to be serious for this discussion because it was damned important. I get through telling her all about it, and want to know if she has questions. Yeah, so, the life insurance. How does that work? She says. I don't really know, baby. What do you mean? She answers, well, do they just put the money in there? Look, she's not trying to be an butthole, right? It's not like she's just dying for the money. She wants to know the logistics of it. I'm sitting here thinking when she says, so do they put in my bank account? Or do they give you one of those big checks when you win the lottery? As she holds her hands up like she's holding a huge check. Laughter ensues. I have it written into the will that if I'm Kia, I want the $400k to be given to her with a gigantic lottery check. Have base photo bring several folks over. Shoot like the paparazzi she stands on a stage. And do it. Lol. Not exactly a reading of the will story but in the same realm. When I was like 20 my dad told me that when he died I would be getting a chunk of money. Not millions but enough to do something good with. Years later he and my mom separated. He met a new woman and got married. After talking to my brother and sister we were all worried that she would change his will or get him to change it in favor of her kids. We agreed that we didn't want money but just wanted any final wishes to be honored. The money couldn't hurt though. Sadly after that he got cancer and died 2 years ago. After he died my siblings and I agreed to just accept however his widow divided anything. She made sure things went where he had decided. My percentage was smaller because he had added her and her children. In the 2 years since he passed she hasn't talked to us much. She calls for holidays and stuff. She tries but she is just kinda awkward. She's also sent large sums of money on 2 occasions because she sold some land he owned. She has shown me and my siblings that there are still good people. Sure, she might have kept most of the money but she could have kept all of the money and we would never have known. When I was 16 my dad wrote me out of his will and then hung himself in the garage. It was few months after my older brother had died in a car wreck. Funny thing is, we always got along. I was then kicked out of the house by his wife, without a single thing that was mine. It was on Christmas Eve, so I went to my mom's for a night, and when I came back to my dad's, the locks were changed. Not a single shirt, not a shoe, not a sock, nothing but the cloths on my back and the change in my pocket. When I was a clerk in law school at the State Court of Appeals, the adult children of a rich woman tried to invalidate the will. Basically the woman was worth about $8 million and all the children were working professionals earning 6 or 7 figures. Well, the woman had used the same hairdresser for multiple years and left a considerable amount in a trust for the hairdresser's children's education. The remainder of the estate was given to different charities. Basically the kids were mad they didn't get a cut. If it comes up, like, if you're wealthy, leaving $1,000 to each kid will make it a lot more difficult to invalidate. Leave them nothing and they can create a lot of doubt and questions. Serious, family court lawyers, what's the most petty behavior you've seen from parents? I'm just an intern, but I once was sifting through discovery that our client provided, as he was trying to win custody over his son. One of these pieces of discovery was a detailed account of the mother's timeliness. Basically, if the mother was late to pick up her son, they would time it and document it, which would make sense if it was significant, but I'm not exaggerating. Over a 6-month period, she was late for a total of 33 minutes. Seeing as they met to exchange the child 3 times a week, it means she was late by about 1 or 2 minutes once a week. It was the most insignificant piece of data that I have ever seen in my entire life, but the client was adamant that we use it in court to prove that the mother was irresponsible. Most comments here are just talking about despicable people, but this truly is the pettiest of petty. Family law legal assistant here. A client of ours included a chunk of pork in the freezer in her list of assets that she insisted she get back. The lawyer on the other side came back with respectfully, I'm not going to argue over second-hand meat in a freezer. My GF is a family lawyer. She had a pair from Eastern Europe, we're in Ontario, who wanted a divorce. Long fight over what the husband's assets were. He claimed to be living on less than $12,000 cash a year. Wife hired a private detective. Eventually found that he was hiding another home. Won a big settlement. My GF is really happy. Note, she doesn't get a penny of the settlement or bonus or extra pay. She just liked seeing the lawyer caught. But the wife still isn't happy. Claims the husband is hiding even more money. Keeps badgering him with more legal stuff. Even though my GF is telling her you won, let it be. Then, husband hires a pie. Finds out the wife is joint owner of another house with her new boyfriend. Settlement invalidated. My GF immediately got off the record and refused to help the woman anymore. Worked in an attorney's office for a little bit. Knew about a divorce case one of the attorneys was involved in where the child had been diagnosed with a terminal disease with maybe a few years left, and the parents tried to fight over what the child's wish should be for one of those make-a-wish type of foundations. I do know the judge chewed both parents a new one when this issue came up, but ultimately could not make a call on how the wish would be granted. I believe the child ending up refusing the wish on account of the argument it caused between the parents. Just hearing about the details of this case fricked me up for a while. Not really petty but more psychotic. My dad received full custody and won everything in the divorce because my mom was diagnosed with a multitude of mental problems that she refused to take medication for, and she was an abusive alcoholic who also did more funsies. Anyways, after all that was said and done, she decided she'd show us. When we were gone she'd break into the house and steal random crap like Tupperware lids. All of the Tupperware lids. I crap you not. We came home from school and all of the forks were gone, so we went to Walmart and bought forks. Came home with forks and all of the spoons were gone. We found out she'd been getting in through my bedroom window, so we put a lock on the window and put up security cameras. Didn't work out because 3 days later while we were gone we got her on video stealing. Yes, actually stealing the window and running down the road. Before you ask, yes, we have a restraining order. Yes, we turned the tapes over to the cops. No, you can't have a crazy person put into a mental hospital against their will unless they are a physical threat to themselves or others. Yes, she still randomly steals stuff from my dad's house. It's more of an amusement now though. You always decorate the tops of your cabinets with stuff and forget about it, so we play this game called What Used to Be There. $3,000 between me and another very good lawyer to argue about $13 month versus $30 month child support. They had 50/50 custody. The kid was 13. Even after I did the math for my client explaining they were paying me more than the difference for the entire rest of child support, they still wanted to do it. When I was a kid and my parents were divorcing, my dad filed many lawsuits against my mother for anything and everything. When I was 10 years old, he even told me he was going to take me to court in a lawsuit because I didn't want to go visit him. Client once called me with an emergency. The emergency was that his soon-to-be ex-wife fed the kid Chef Boyardee for dinner. I went to law school for this. The interim court order said that my client, the mom, was not to discuss the court proceedings with the child. During an access visit, the child asked her, "When will I get to see you again?" and my client responded, "We'll have to see, but hopefully soon." The father then argued that this was discussing the court proceedings with the child and tried using it as an excuse to deny any further access. As an intern, I saw a couple have long, hateful emails about who was going to keep a unisex Armani hoodie. Almost all of their discussion centered on that one hoodie. When in the end the husband got to keep it, the wife cut holes into it which ruined it. It was pretty nice tbh. What I get from this is that if you ever divorce someone really petty, put a lot of focus on a few random items you don't actually care about. A mother actively coaching her 2 kids to say that dad was physically abusive to them. She would have gotten away with it except for 2 things. 1. The court-appointed psych managed to catch these lies out in the interview. To date, longest report I have read at 280 pages. And 2. The oldest kid, then 10 I think, got annoyed at the mother for some such reason and recorded her on their cell phone, which was promptly played for dad. In the end, dad got full day to daycare and mother had supervised contact for 6 months before she went to every second weekend. This is probably one of the worst things yet. This happened in January. Guy was straight out of jail, 2 years, and of course at that point, his marriage was rocky as heck. When his wife dropped his kids off to visit, he lived with his parents for parole purposes. The son said his uncle hit him. The father then filed a PFA against the wife and uncle. It was granted. Then he files for sole custody. It was granted. The kids were in his custody for about 2 months before the custody hearing. Of course, my boss threw me the file and I had to handle the mediation and last minute prep. At mediation, the father and wife sit angry-eyed. Literally, each cross-armed and furious. The other lawyer and I discuss the facts and what arrangement each client wants briefly in another room. We come out and our clients are gone. Magically, and praise the Lord. In the course of 10 minutes of me and the lawyer talking, the father and mother made out in the corner of the hallway and returned. The case was dropped. May I mention, this was pro bono, PA jurisdiction, too. The worst I was ever a part of. In California we have certain requirements to meet before one parent can move away with the child. These requirements kick in when the other parent's visitation will be materially impacted by the move. My client is mom. She is a dental hygienist. She has kids with dentist 1 and divorces dad for dentist 2. She wants to move with the kids to dentist 2's town so she can work for him, live closer to work, etc. Dentist 2's town is a 25-minute drive away from dentist 1's town. 25 minutes. Between the 2 of them, the 2 dentists must have spent nearly $400k fighting over a 25-minute move. This was also the moment I realized I made a terrible mistake becoming a lawyer when I should have become a dentist. My first job out of law school was as a trial court staff attorney. This is basically a judicial law clerk. So we did a lot of research and advisory memos for judges. I didn't cover a family law docket, but my office mate did. She got an emergency motion in a family law case one time. For the non-lawyers, these are filed when something is extremely time sensitive and critically, like a matter of life and death. Important. If the judge deems it a true emergency, your matter will be heard on an expedited basis. They'll fast track you in for a hearing, usually in a matter of days, rather than the usual weeks months it normally takes to get a hearing date. Anyhow, this particular emergency motion was to compel the ex-spouse to send their child to Happy Faces daycare, because if the child couldn't go to Happy Faces daycare, it was going to be irreparably damaged from the lack of social exposure, etc. Emergency. Happy Faces daycare. FML. Needless to say, this was not an emergency. I don't know how the motion was ultimately ruled on, other than that it wasn't an emergency. Man, my ex literally has done this 3-4 times to me. One successful time she got my son away from me for around 3 months with a lawyer postponing the court date multiple times. We're still in custody court 5 years later on and off. It sucks. Canadian family lawyer here. Many instances of pettiness. Generally, good family lawyers will call their client on their bulls. We don't want to be the lawyer standing in front of a judge over really petty things. Reputation is important. Client. My son is very mature for his age. I believe access to his mother should be per his discretion. Me. Your 2-year-old son. That said, I've had people call my office yelling that my client wouldn't allow them to pick up the infant child at 10 p.m. Only 4 hours late for a visit. One guy fired 2 previous lawyers and retained me to negotiate adding 3 meaningless words to a settlement. We're talking months of intense negotiations between counsel. One parent refused to allow another parent to take kids on vacation because they wanted to take the child to Disney first, despite, you know, not having the funds to do so. The most petty are the parents who phone CAS, Child Protection Services, or the police for every minor disagreement. Your 2-year-old cries when leaving your home? Call Child Protection Services. One guy was a total control freak. He'd gone to the Philippines and romanced his now ex-wife, brought her back to Australia and then expected her to be a slave for him, pop out his kids, etc etc. When she left him, he manipulated her into believing that they would share care of the kids, and they didn't need court orders. Then behind her back he went to court, obtained sole custody of the kids and basically cut her out. Then when she was back on her feet and could finally go back to court and try to get her kids back, he said she was a prostitute, among other things. He said the kids were learning sexualized behavior from her, despite the fact that he was living in a trailer caravan modified shipping container, something like that, with no actual walls between the kids' room and the bedroom he shared with his new partner, and the mother was living in a house with bedrooms and doors. Real nice guy. In the end, he didn't use a lawyer, so he was completely steamrolled in court. His court documents were laughable. Literally everything that had ever gone wrong with the kids was the mother's fault, and he now sees the kids once a fortnight instead of having them live with him full time. So there's a way not to do things. Also, hilariously, one of the things he said in court was that he knew when he was impregnating the mother, because he can control his ejaculation. Right. I've seen some BS pettiness, but the best story I have is actually from my guardian ad litem professor. When she was practicing, she had a client whose ex-wife was super duper specific about getting all of the children's clothes back from his house when she got the kids back from him. Like, if one sock was left behind, all heck would break loose. So this guy's solution was to make the children strip naked in the foyer and put on clothes specifically worn at his place when it was his turn to have them. Then when they went back to mom's, they had to strip naked again and change back into the clothes she sent them therein. Sounds a bit scarring for the children. Father wanted full custody of his child. Child was in full mother's custody. Child has diabetes. Both parents must fill a daily glucose intake measured by glucometer. Every time father dropped the child at mom's, he would buy a Snickers or Twix on the way there and feed it to the kid. Then we flipped out the glucose measurings during court. Due to the measurings being extremely high when the child was at mom's, we were able to get the child to the father's full custody. I didn't know what he was doing. I certainly didn't advise him to do it. He just bring it to the courthouse and ordered me to present it. Either that or that time where during divorce a guy had exact knowledge of how many toilet paper sheets his wife was overusing and how many liters of warm water she overused. Worked in a law firm dealing in family matters. Couple hammers out a separation agreement over months of meetings, mediation, letters and drafts back and forth. ended up having to take it to court because they couldn't agree on who would get the air miles. The fricking air miles. An opposing party had to pay $2,000 in attorney's fees to his wife's lawyer, and he brought it to the office in pennies. Client's spouse of decades gets a terminal cancer diagnosis about halfway into a fairly routine medium-high asset divorce. My client is such a viciously horrible person, saying they were glad that the spouse was dying, that the opposing party's literal dying wish is to be divorced and never see a spouse of 30 plus years again. Divorce lawyers of Reddit. What's the most outrageous reason someone filed for divorce? My aunt was dating an unemployed dude for a while. He was staying in her house rent-free. They got married and were getting ready to go on the honeymoon when the new husband tells her he's not going because he has to take care of his plants at the house. Big fight. Aunt goes on the honeymoon with her sisters instead. She comes home and tries to kick him out of her house. He refuses to leave. She tries to get the police involved. Dude is live streaming on Facebook how he is being trapped in his own home. Police tell my aunt there is basically nothing they can do. Can file for eviction after a divorce. Dude gets to live in her house with his precious plants for like 3 months until everything legally gets worked out. Paralegal. A couple got divorced over a cat. Wife called cat Snowball because of white fur and only wanted the cat to eat wet food or chicken breast. Husband called cat Lily again because of white fur and believed it should only eat dry food. These two argued for a year over custody of the cat but did not give a crap about their human kids aged 15 months, 4 years, and 6 years old. Not a lawyer, but I have been aching to tell this story for a while. So this girl I went to school with marries this rich guy from Ohio. She moves in with him and they seem to get along well. 6 months later she files for divorce. Up to that point, all I've heard from her was how good it was going. Anyways, it turns out our buddy had a fetish for urine. He asked her to urinate on him in the tub. At first she agrees to it as she thought it was a one-time thing, but he kept asking for it more and more. She tried to decline it respectfully but he wouldn't get any of the hints. She finally used the tub being too small as a reason. Next day she comes home with 24 construction guys and their heavy equipment tearing the bathroom walls. A week or so later, they finish up the bathroom. She comes home to a sign left on the fridge with a note to drink up. She got some watering to do. I don't know what exactly she put down as the official reason in the paperwork, but that was definitely her biggest reason to walk out of that relationship. Oh, I forgot to add, he also wanted to bring a horse to do the deed as well and at times asked her to make animal sounds while she stood on top of him. My aunt had a case where the wife had glued all of the outdoor hoses together so he wouldn't spend more time washing his vehicle anymore. When the glue didn't work she just cut them all up. When he bought new ones they filed for divorce. My 90-year-old client, the husband, and his son retained me to initiate divorce proceedings with his 88-year-old wife. They'd been married 60 years. The wife had recently taken to beating him with his own cane because their daughter poisoned her into thinking he was hiding money from them. The battle came down to husband and son versus wife and daughter. At their first court appearance, my client showed up in an old 1950s style pinstripe suit and fedora. He was a farmer his whole life, and this was clearly the only suit he owned. He was such a meek and lovely old gentleman. I had to pass my client on to a new lawyer midway through the proceedings because I accepted a job in a different country, but I understand the divorce was eventually granted. This one hurts. Imagine spending that much of your life with someone and then it breaks. 60 years is no joke. I would have been devastated. Colleague handled a case where money was not an issue but the kids were. Neither parent wanted them. My mom worked in abuse and neglect counseling and juvenile justice. There are a lot more cases like this than I'd care to admit. Parents divorce and neither side wants a kid. Some of them are that neither side wants one kid but will fight over another kid. It ends up totally screwing them over because they have to live with the fact that their parents didn't want them. I represented a P actress webcam model who filed for divorce from her husband who also did the P webcam model business. He would do gay P on the side because the pay was better. She was hesitant about it, but dealt with it because the pay was decent. Both sides had an agreement that it wasn't cheating as long as it was for work. One day she came home early and found her husband in bed with 2 men. They were not filming. That was too much for her. Needless to say, the old conservative judge couldn't wrap his head around this one. I'm imagining explaining this situation to my grandfather and I'm having a hard time because I think he would have a stroke before I finished explaining. When I clerked for a judge, we had a week-long divorce trial between a couple. The husband was a wildlife photographer and the wife was a stay-at-home wife. No kids, who helped remodel the home. Anyway, husband was mauled by a grizzly bear he was photographing, spent several months in the hospital and rehab and was served papers shortly after getting out. Now without an eye and with severe scarring on his face and side. She wanted half of everything. The non-scarred half at least. Not a divorce lawyer, but I had a friend whose parents divorced for irreconcilable differences over time spent playing EverQuest. In my game design class, it was referred to as EverCrack. My dad was a divorce lawyer. He had a client who wanted to divorce her husband for 2 reasons. 1. He did not have enough hair on his chest. 2. He did not drive fast enough. Keep in mind this was in the 70s when chest hair was a bit more important. Crap, yeah, it would have been embarrassing to show up late at a pool party and your man not having a decent chest bush. My grandfather's brother was a judge who presided over state issue marriages from time to time. One couple he married returned 6 months later to confirm the wedding and end their trial marriage. When he thusly informed them that there was no such thing and that they had been married for 6 months, they subsequently broke up. That sounds nutty, but if you believed you so when they told you trial marriages were a real thing, the betrayal could very easily end a marriage. I didn't like her anymore 2 days after being married. In sickness and in heath, till disinterest do you part. She was kidnapped in Mexico and he refused to pay ransom. Eventually her family managed to pay and she was left on the side of the road. It is not outrageous as in petty, but outrageous as how absurd that is. Honey, I love you, but we agreed to save up money so we can purchase a house. Your ransom would really set us back. I'm an intern, but the judge I work for used to do divorce work. He has some crazy stories, but this one is probably the most outrageous, though the divorce was pretty justified. Every morning this couple would sit in the bathroom together while one of them had their morning dump. One would sit on the toilet and the other on the rim of the bathtub. This particular morning the wife was on the toilet and husband on the edge of the tub. They started to argue about their relationship, so the wife reaches down, pulls her tampon out and flings it at husband. I'm told the tampon stuck for a brief second to his forehead before sliding off. He filed for divorce that same day or the next. At first I read this as one shoots in the toilet while the other shoots into the bathtub, as in they are both pooping simultaneously, and rock paper scissors for who gets to use the toilet. I was so concerned. I knew a guy from a high school job who divorced his wife of 2 months because she would sleep with a nightlight, but he could only sleep in total darkness, as they apparently never lived together until after getting married. He hated her nightlight so much that he would often sleep on the couch instead, but sometimes he would claim the bed for himself and lock her out of the bedroom for the night. This was an eccentric late 40s man working at a Burger King who acted like all the other high school co-workers were his best chums, and often told us these weird stories. I'm glad I don't work with him anymore. Failed exorcisms. Client had an inner ear condition that caused chronic vertigo, but symptoms could be treated with medication. Husband was an evangelical who was convinced his wife 1. Had become possessed and that her vertigo and general crankiness with his methods were evidence of demonic possession. 2. The medication she was taking was enabling the devil to hide inside her. And 3. The only proper recourse was exorcism. He would hide her meds until she got dizzy and then try various methods of exorcism. This included sweating it out, put under blankets while incapacitated and locked in a room full of space heater, freezing it out, pretty much the reverse with AC, fans, and bags of ice. Surprising it out, he would jump out and scare her like it was the hiccups, but instead of yelling boo he would recite the Lord's Prayer or Psalms. The final straw was that he tried to surprise it out of her by pushing her down the stairs when they were heading out for dinner. Note, this guy was some type of executive and they still went out to dinner after the stairs incident. She asked for the divorce at an Applebee's that night. I have often tried to picture that conversation, as she was adamant that he was a total sweetheart and never acted out of malice or anger. That one's just sad. My uncle has schizophrenia. And my grandaunt tried to convince my grandmother, his mom, to have an exorcist come instead of letting him stay on his medications. It's probably one of the reasons my grandmother stopped talking to them much. It pains me to think he could have gone through all of that if he'd been one of my grandaunt's son instead of my grandmother's. He had an argument with the new in-laws during the wedding and moved out at around 5 AM during the first night. I was a legal assistant when this case came in, but this lady divorced her husband of 2 months because he got her an iPad case for her birthday instead of the expensive jewelry she wanted. My client put his wife in an assisted living facility based on a misdiagnosis, the medication of which caused the wife to be unable to care for herself. While in the facility, my client shocker started dating another woman and methinks began using hard drugs. He used a lot of money on both of these things. She eventually got off the medication and got better. Suffice to say, she was not happy about what had transpired. Wasn't the reason but did happen during the course of the divorce. Neither side would follow the court orders. When they had to go back to court they were fighting over a pistol and the man's grandmother's bowls. I assumed for weeks that these bowls were some sort of heirloom or expensive china. When they finally brought the bowls in to swap they were freaking Tupperware. My husband's first marriage lasted 6 months. He found out she had been sleeping around with several of his friends and one of those friends finally felt so guilty that he fessed up. Husband actually wanted to work it out if he could, but when he tried to talk to her about it, she locked him out of the house and told him she wanted a divorce. "Why did you marry me?" he finally asked her. Her response? Because he was the only one she was sleeping with who could afford her dream wedding. Yup, B married him because she wanted a wedding and chose the person who could afford it. Mind you, he wasn't wealthy by any means. He just wishes his friend had felt guilty about say, 6 months sooner. I had some friends get divorced because she legit hated Dale Earnhardt and he legit hated Jeff Gordon. My douche cousin told his wife she had 3 chances to give him a son. Daughter was born first, strike 1. Son was born second. Then they find out the boy can't eat gluten. So my cousin divorced her and has made 0 effort to see his kids. Who's your cousin? Henry V.I.E. My great-great-grandparents had an interesting case. He was abusive, like pimp her out and then beat her for infidelity levels of abuse. This was the 1910s, though, and in our state you couldn't initiate a divorce for cruelty. In fact, the only possible grounds for divorce was infidelity. A few times, she tried just leaving him anyway. Once he came home from work and she, plus all 8 of their kids, were just gone. But he always found them, and since they were still married, he had every right to grab the kids and go back home with them. Finally, she moved out and went to live with another man. She flaunted the new guy around town until her no-good husband got embarrassed enough to sue her for divorce on the grounds of infidelity. Although she couldn't read or write, she put her ex on those papers the minute he served her. It was a major local scandal, very Catholic community. Divorce was rare, but she got what she needed to be safe. My client was the outrageous one, so my heart went out to his poor wife. He had OCD which manifested primarily financially, so he made their lives a penny pinching heck. Examples: he was obsessed with avoiding unnecessary driving, wear and tear on the car, gas expenses, so he cut the whole family's hair at home and never let them eat at a restaurant or go to the movies. Weirdest of all, he kept 1 toilet paper roll on him at all times and you had to get 1 square from him before you could go to the bathroom. He never gave more than 1 square. Wife finally got fed up and left him when 1. He gave her bangs during an in-home haircut and 2. Their daughter was so traumatized by the toilet paper thing they couldn't potty train her. Also, he hated paying his divorce lawyer bill. He was also an old-fashioned mega Catholic who considered divorce a deadly sin. He viewed my whole job as an unnecessary and sinful expense. Not me, but a friend. My mum has divorced her husband because his mother still coddled him at age 40, with his consent. They lived with his mother, common in Asia. By coddle I mean that she would walk straight into their room after his shower and powder his back for him. They couldn't lock their bedroom door because his mother would come in as and when she wanted. If they locked the door, she would knock repeatedly asking what they were doing. I worked as a paralegal for a divorce lawyer. Case analysis was one of my main responsibilities. I crap you not. A recently married couple of 2 years broke it off because the husband would not stop feeding the dog. The dog got outrageously fat. Apparently she saw connection between the dog and future children. I am a lawyer that handles quite a few divorces, among other things, and I've seen all sorts of reasons for marriages ending. The only thing that is consistently true is that it is never for just one reason, and it is never one-sided. When you hear about people divorcing over one stupid argument or mistake, usually that's just the straw that broke the camel's back. That said, some of the lighter straws I've seen include a guy who is 100% convinced that his wife, our client, is actually a lesbian in love with his sister and just using him as a cover. But he also claims she is hooking up with me to pay for her legal fees, and with every male whose phone number is in her call history. A woman who is divorcing my client because he was too sad after his father died last year. My client had to break down her door to get his father's ashes a few weeks after he left the house and she refused to let him back in or give them to him. And a woman who claims my client was emotionally abusive towards her because he refused to yell at her and sat in silence ignoring her when she screamed at him. He has this recorded, time-stamped for the dates and times she insists the incidents occurred, and she's listened to them and his complete silence as she goes on tirades and insists this proves her point that he was emotionally distant and abusive. A friend of mine got married when she was 19 so she could drink at a bar. In Wisconsin you can drink underage with a parent or a spouse. Then when she turned 21 she got a divorce since she was legal to drink without him. Seems like an easy in and out transaction, but oh no. The biggest item they fought over was the garage beer refrigerator. Go figure. Not the most outrageous, but I had a client incur about 20 additional hours of billable hours because he and his ex-wife were battling and went to trial over their Star Wars collection. This was the only issue at trial. They were able to work out custody, child support, the house, but the Star Wars collection went to trial. The judge ended up splitting it in the most arseholish way possible, basically giving each side half of what they wanted and then mixing and matching everything else and breaking up collections. When speaking about it at a conference, the judge admitted she did it because if they were going to act like children, she would treat them like children. The thing is, the value of this collection was over $100K, so hardly kids stuff. Neither side had it in them to appeal, nor was the case law on either side given judicial discretion in property distribution. Worked in matrimonial law for a year and a half before I had to leave BC. It just overwhelmed me with how awful humanity is. I'll never forget filing papers that described her soon-to-be ex-husband's behavior, including master baits on the living room couch without closing the door and leaves sticky tissues everywhere with further description of their 3 young children potentially walking in on him. I have a friend who used to work as a clerk for a family court judge. The minute a new job opened up working for a criminal court judge she jumped on it because, as she put it, dealing with murderers all day is one heck of a lot easier than dealing with divorcing couples all day. I do my student practice at my family's law firm. Young woman filed for a divorce because her husband drank 1 beer during weekdays after a day of work. The guy wasn't violent, doing drugs, or anything like that. He was just a normal, polite guy who liked to have a cold one after a 10-hour shift. They are a very good couple and argue so rarely that this woman's friends told her to write down everything he did to upset her and reread it every day, so she had reasons to be angry. My mom, lawyer, set the woman straight, told her he just doing what all guys do and to find herself new friends instead of ones ready to sabotage their marriage. Not necessarily the most outrageous reason, but definitely some outrageous conduct. The saddest divorce we were hired to do, but ended up not doing for reasons that'll become apparent, was a woman in her 50s whose husband had really just let himself go. He was over 400 pounds, just did his 3rd triple bypass, refused to do anything different, just smoked and drank all day long while watching TV. His doctors told him he was going to die in 6 months if he didn't change his behavior. He told them they were all morons and could go to heck. Meanwhile, his wife is this successful woman who makes over $10K a month on her hobby, while making 6 figures in her normal work. She lost all respect for him, all desire, and all love for him by watching his decline. For the past few years, She can barely stand him. It also sounded like there was some verbal abuse going on where he constantly accused her of cheating and gaslighting her while cheating himself throughout their marriage and spending all his money on coke. The usual. His accusations ramped up considerably once she lost about 200 pounds the good old-fashioned way. We were working on her divorce and one of her provisions was that he keep her as the beneficiary on his life insurance. For obvious reasons, she assured us he would agree to everything she suggested in the paperwork if she talked him through it. One day, we get an email from her saying to hold the divorce. Not because they were reconciling, but because he refused to keep her as the beneficiary on his life insurance if they divorced. So, she stopped the divorce, so that she could get the benefits when he inevitably dies in a few months. He got drunk at the wedding. She did not like it, and decided to divorce him right after the honeymoon, which she went without him. Moreover, this was all an elaborate scheme of divorce robbery, because the guy was loaded, and so was his entire family. They were loaded because they were a family of excellent lawyers, and he was a third-generation lawyer, with all the smarts and experience of his predecessors combined. Let's just say it did not go well for her. I am not a lawyer, but I am a court clerk. The magistrate I used to work with got a petition for divorce and the reason the wife gave was he should have been more forthcoming about his shortcomings in the bedroom. Not a lawyer, but my uncle's wife left him because he was spending most of the time at the hospital with my dying grandfather instead of spending time with her. I work with a guy whose wife is currently peed because he hasn't been taking sufficient care of the lawn for the last few months. He works weird night shift hours full time. She's a teacher currently not working since it's summer. Oh, and his dad is terminally ill dying in a hospital bed right now, but she still has the audacity to be about the lawn not getting mowed. Was allowed shower at the dinner table. He developed a complex and literally needed out as he couldn't bear to eat with her. This sounds like a Seinfeld B-plot. Now, but my father's best friend divorced his wife over her cooking. Apparently, every day he would come home to amazing cooked meals. However, she couldn't cook at all and was ordering food from different restaurants. She even went as far as dirtying pots and pans to make it look like she cooked all day. She got away with this for almost a year before he caught on. This was back in the day before you could check your bank statements online, and since she did all the billing, he didn't notice how much money was missing that she was spending on takeout. Not a divorce lawyer, but got out of my first marriage because shortly after we got married he decided he didn't like the way I talked and asked me not to talk when we were out in company unless I could talk straight. I'm not a lawyer, but I was once buying a computer from someone on Craigslist, and when I got to his house it was full of computers everywhere. There were monitors laying on the floor and half-built computers laying around. Full-built computers all over the place. And I'm talking expensive gaming computers, not your everyday all-in-one computers. We got to talking about why he had so many and the guy said he was just obsessed with them, and he confessed that the reason his wife divorced him was because she said I was too obsessed with my computers. I'm not a lawyer, but I was once buying a computer from someone on Craigslist. Good enough for me. The dog he bought me peed on the carpet. To be fair, it really tied the room together. Taught the parakeet certain cuss words for his wife. The parrot lives with the man now. I thought about going towards family law, and then I realized I'm gonna have to deal with things such as who's gonna get the parrot and grandma's vase. Nope. Divorce lawyer in London. Had a client who indulged in some recreational drug use. His dealer lives in the same apartment building as him. Went down one day to pick up some of that sweet coke. When drug dealer, female, came to the door he could hear his wife in the background. Turns out that his wife also liked the high life and was getting her fix in with the neighborhood dealer. But it doesn't end there, because they all get on so well they start having parties and hanging out. Parties become drug-fueled orgies, and hey presto, each week the husband and wife put their kids to bed and head downstairs to the dealer's flat for a feast of drugs and flesh. A couple of months go by and the wife comes home and says she is leaving him to be in a full-time same-sex relationship with the dealer. Dude is now stressed AF, but he can't score no more from his dealer who stole his missus. Just a reminder, nobody in this story is as attractive as what you are thinking. It's not a ridiculous reason, it's a ridiculous scenario. Happened to a friend. Girlfriend wanted a cat even though it was against rules in that building. My friend caved and they got one. Then she brought another one home without asking what he thought about it. Didn't get that one fixed. It had 2 different litters. When it was all said and done they had 12 cats in a 2-bedroom house and she didn't think it was a problem even though it drove him out of his mind. Now, but the story of the couple in Algeria always gets me. Groom sees his new wife the morning after the wedding without makeup, takes her for an intruder, and proceeds to sue for over $10K for psychological trauma. Smelly feet. Though there's no divorce in my country, only annulment, my client can't stand the smell of his wife's feet. Lucky for him because incompatibility clause includes smelly feet. I was smelling the whole process and the judge laughed examining the evidence of his wife having a smelly feet. You have been visited by the romantic doggo. Comment love is magic so you never fall in the friend zone. Like and subscribe you magnificent person.